Hello, everyone, to this virtual lecture today. I'm honored and excited to introduce a very special speaker, my dear friend and co-author, Wolfgang Schaefer. Hello, Wolfgang.
Hello, everybody.
And I think you're over in Berlin, is that right?
I am. I
Here
am
we go.
actually in my home in Berlin, not even in the office.
The global classroom. So Wolfgang today is going to talk about communication and brand elevation in two parts. So there's going to be two little videos for you to watch, little or long, let's see. The first part is going to talk about the importance and the role of storytelling, and in particular, how to elevate a story to mythical levels. And Wolfgang will explain why that is a great thing to do. He'll also talk a little bit about core ingredients that go into a good story and a myth in particular, and how to construct it to be very powerful. So that part, if you want, part one is about the what to do to get to create your narrative, to get your communication across. In part two, Wolfgang will dive into more of the how to do it, how to execute this. He'll talk about style, because particularly with elevated brands, luxury brands, lifestyle brands, style matters. And he'll also talk about how the message can be the medium, which is a strong way to communicate rather than to do blatant and obvious advertising, as we'll see. And then at the very end, the myth will come in again, because the myth, as he'll explain to us, is kind of the meta story, the meta myth that holds it all together and guides the execution. So very exciting subject. Let me tell you a little bit about Wolf. Wolf has been in the communication business since birth, almost. He's studied it.
It certainly feels that way.
Let's say a quarter of a century to make you feel younger. He's studied in Germany, in the US, and very broadly, which I think gives him that kind of richness that makes him a true expert in developing narratives, but also understanding communication and consumers. You can see it here: economics, theater, a master's in social and business communication. As we said, he's now based in New York and Berlin. Importantly, he worked for quite a long time in ad agencies as a chief strategy officer. And that's why I met him about 10 years ago, when I was in Procter & Gamble in corporate strategy. And we were trying to figure out what it was that made premium and lifestyle brands grow despite the crisis. And quickly we found out that while there are mechanics in pricing, sizing, etc., it was really the meaningfulness and the cultural context that was driving the success of these brands. And so Wolfgang and I joined up and we created a cross-functional team. We researched kind of what are the principles that drive success in what we would later call Ueber-Brands. And at the very end of that, the outcome was the book that you all hopefully have in front of you. Thank you very much. And the second book, actually, that we just finished and that has been published about brand elevation, which is the how-to. So you have the model and the how-to. But I think without further ado, that's pretty much it. Wolfgang, anything important that I skipped?
Oh God, so many things that happened in my life.
He's
That
such
made
a
me
complex
such a glamorous and
personality, you need to
important
know.
person. No. Everything's well said. Very well said. There's hardly anything left for me to say.
Wonderful. I'm sure there's a lot to say. So here we go. Wolfgang Schaefer on brand elevation and communication.
Yeah, so myth to many is what we call this seminar, the topic today. And as JP just said, it's part in two parts. The first part, before the break, we're going to insert a break, but the first part is going to be about the myth, the brand myth that that any Uber brand needs to have, and we call it the meta story. There's three parts again that we're going to talk about. The power of storytelling, which is first a quick wrap up. I think everybody's pretty much aware how important storytelling is, but just to kind of refresh your memory in case it's not so present anymore, then what's the difference between a myth and a story? And how do you actually develop a myth, i.e., for instance, with archetypes or kenotypes rather, as we propose? Okay, let's quickly start with a quick wrap of the importance of storytelling. There is a very nice quote from Joanne Didion. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. So basically, that means, and everybody knows that stories have been an integral part of humanity, of us, making us human, actually, ever since the caveman. We communicate through stories, we memorize through stories, we create our perspective on the world through stories. We judge by stories that are being built. And that's why myth and stories are so important. But there's other things that are specifically important in today's age, and particularly in today's world of branding, because the stories also give us soul. When you talk about, when you tell someone's history, someone's life history, for instance, that person all of a sudden appears much more real, much more as an individual versus just a number, where you categorize someone by his specs. You'd say like, he's a 50-year-old male, white, whatever, German, blah, blah, blah. But once you tell a story about where he's coming from, where he's going to, that person becomes much more real. And the same holds true with brands. And that's important if you look at this beautiful shot of Andreas Gursky, which is a little bit Photoshop, but not much. There's lots of stores like that that are just a plethora of brands, of stuff, of products, soulless mass of products that we're drowning in. And we have no idea anymore where these products are coming from, who made them, how were they made, how many children were abused in the process, or how much environment was destroyed, or was it actually a person in some like a real person that working on it and stuff like that. So the idea of storytelling, or the importance of storytelling in today's day and age of branding, is that we want to imbue products that have become meaningless with more meaning, less matter, less kind of just like stuff, but something that becomes a bit more meaningful. You'll see that here, for instance, how nicely that works. This is actually a lakritz licorice brand from Denmark. This is Johan Bülow. He was the founder. And when you go on his website, it really reads like a fairy tale. Once upon a time in 2007, in the town of Svanike on the small Danish island of Bornholm in the Baltic Sea, blah, blah, blah. And on it goes it really reads like a fairy tale. And actually, funnily enough, the whole brand has developed like a fairy tale. It's nowadays, we just, JP already talked about our second book that's just coming out. Peter talks about how this brand grew literally from a mom and pop shop, or he was like a young guy, and now is a multi-million-dollar international brand that's in all the big department stores and specialty stores all over the world. And that shows a little bit the power of storytelling, you know.
Yeah, Wolfgang, I was just going to say, in the book, the Lakritz people tell their story, and it's actually interesting to see how they use it during their sales calls, and how it is the stories and tasting the product itself that makes the difference, rather than any of the numbers, the margins, the sizing, particularly when you're a niche premium brand like that.
And even in a B2B context. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's exactly the point. You know, it's yes, of course, the product needs to support. You can't just live on a story. You know, nobody can. You need to also have some substance. And yes, of course, the numbers need to also kind of like be right for a store to take you on. But at the end of the day, people are people, no matter what professional context they're in. And they still are being more convinced by a nice story of a guy who is passionate about creating the best licorice in the world. And he did it, and da, da, da. And then the story continues. That's much more engaging and much more persuasive than just coming with a chart of numbers, you know. Here is, this is just, I'm not going to show you the whole thing. Everybody who wants to see it can go on Timmy Brothers. It's called, you'll find it on the internet. It's quite funny. It's a spoof actually on the whole kind of artisanal storytelling, crafting kind of thing. And yes, it is a spoof and it's funny, but it also kind of like she really talks about
water is its basic elemental quality. We talk about wetness or moistness. What is wetness? I know what wetness is for me. But what is that for you? It could be something completely different.
We don't need words. I mean, it's almost, I prefer just...
Thirst is the universal language. I'm Terry Timmy.
And I'm Bill Timmy.
And we're water makers.
All right, guys, have some fun with it. Some smiles. Lighten up. This is all good. We're getting your brand out there. So just really lighten it up. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Right.
We're the Timmy brothers, and we make water. Creating bespoke water is storytelling.
When you take a sip of what we make, we're sending you on a journey.
Every drop of water has a story to it. It really does. It's not something that like I'm exaggerating for cameras or anything like that. It's like opening up a Mark Twain story, you know, just without the racist parts. Batch 1402, for example, is a batch that has a mix of the Mississippi River, then over to Lake Pontchartrain, and then came up all the way north and water.
I guess you get the point. It's really it's quite funny. I haven't watched it in a while, and it still makes me smile. It's not very new, but it's still very true. Because it makes fun of the exaggeration or the outgrowth of all of this, but at the heart, we react to stories much more so than we do to soulless stuff. The other thing that's important is just a neuroscientific aspect, that stories make it easier for us to believe. Everybody knows that when you are following a storyline, a movie or whatever, you don't question the logic unless it's like blatantly illogic. But it's much easier if you tell a story where someone does something and that something then survives or succeeds. You just say like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because we're wired in a way that stories kind of like lull us, and there's lots of like scientific tests
research
that have been done where you can actually measure how your brain capacity or activity kind of like alters when you are being told a story. I mean, that's why we have the lullabies and the good night stories and stuff like that. So they lull us in and we follow the flow, and we like our cognitive questioning, our critical mind is basically eased and suspended for the time being. Here's an example of like, and you'll probably see all of these, like they've been called for a while, they've called epiphios, and they've been made a lot, where people explain something rather than giving you a slide where they give you bullet points. They're just going to talk about it with a little bit of visual support, and you get the idea of the argument being
What
made.
is garbage? Well, look at it one way, and almost everything you see is, or soon will be, garbage. You've got today's garbage, things like plastic wrappers, empty food containers, out-of-style clothes, your old cell phone. And you've got tomorrow's garbage, the bag of full groceries you just brought home, that sweet new t-shirt, your 3G MP3 playing pocket computer. It's easy to see everything as garbage when you realize that 99% of the things you buy will be in the dump in 1 year. But the problem with seeing everything as garbage is that before long, everything, I mean the whole planet, will be trashed. We're producing billions of tons of garbage a year, and the problem is just growing. But you can look at it another way, the way nature does. And garbage doesn't exist at all. Did you know that all the ants in the world weigh more than all the humans in the world? Yet ants don't create even a single pound of garbage ever? That's because in nature, one system's garbage is just food for another system. That's the big idea in nature. And that's the big idea behind TerraCycle. We don't see garbage. We see valuable raw materials to make amazing new products that are cooler, cheaper, and way more sustainable. Millions of people, top manufacturers and major retailers are joining us to trash the whole idea of garbage and save the planet. I hope you'll join us too.
So obviously, as you saw, that this is an epiphio or an explanatory video for TerraCycle, which is the big mega brand that doesn't really do much new. There's been recycling all along. There's been upcycling for quite a while. There's been repurposing, but they do it in a manner that they've really managed to get all the big FMCG companies, but all communities and governmental agencies, et cetera, across the world on board, largely because the founder, Tom, is a very charismatic guy with a great story, personal story behind, which you can read about in our book, but also then the stories that he tells about his product or his approach, his service. It's not a product, it's actually the absence of products, or the absence of the leftovers of products that he's dealing with. So what we are saying is basically you should move away from what's traditionally been called RTB's reasons to believe, because as the word already says, reasons to believe talks to your critical brain, to your thinking, and then you start questioning. Is it really a reason? Is that true? Could that be true? Whereas if you tell a story to believe, an STB, it's much easier for people to kind of like take it to heart, never mind the fact that it's also much more emotional and much more engaging. So, and then lastly, the third point, why stories are so important and thus myths are important, is that stories, of course, let us talk. It's much easier for people to connect with us in this day and age where we all are connected through communication, social media, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, if you have a meta story, a myth for your brand that you can then break down into little bits and news stories all along that people can connect with. So it's much more interactive, it's much more engaging, and it will create what everybody wants, basically the engagement and the communication of the community around your brand or around your product. As this example shows about from Patagonia, the stories we wear, where people share their stories that they had with specific products, which at the same time imbues those products and makes them even much more interesting and glamorous. Or here a more a corporate kind of like approach, or Hollywood approach, no matter which way you want to look at it. Obviously, it was sponsored by Ford and by Ferrari, is to be assumed. But it's the story about Ford versus Ferrari in way back. For those who haven't seen the film, watch it. It's actually a stellar performance of Christian Bale. Matt Damon as well, but Christian Bale particularly. But no, it's just talks about the seminal moment at a race where Ford tried to take on Ferrari and actually did successfully. Unfortunately, they lost that again, and whereas Ferrari kept it. So, in a summary, what we always sell is tell, don't sell, particularly in Ueber-Brands, because if you sell too blatantly, it becomes kind of vulgar and boring anyway. But if you tell, not only do you wrap your sales pitch into something that's much more interesting, chances are you'll also be much more emotionally engaging, and people will ask much less questions and gobble it up more willingly. By the way, that's a study from 2012 where Rob Walker and Joshua Glenn, they bought like little trinkets, cheap little stuff, wrote a story to it, put it on the internet, and so the stuff sold on average with like hundreds and hundreds % more. So they bought stuff in total for $130 and got $3,600 out of it. So 2,800 actually value increase that they managed just by imbuing these little cheapy things with stories of some grandmas or some loved ones or whatever it is, you know? So every brand has a history, and that's a very important point, but it's a history in and of itself is not a story. A history is, again, just facts. What you need to do, or what marketers today need to do, is turn their history into a story, where they drop certain parts that are not so relevant, and they highlight certain parts that are. Key points. Stories have the power to imbue objects with meaning. They can give us soul, make us believe. Stories let us talk and engage with brands and one another. A brand history is not a brand story, and that's a very important point. So don't think just by regurgitating the history, you'll have a story already. STBs are stronger than RTBs. By the way, in the book, we talk a lot about what it takes to build a strong story. And there's obviously lots of classes online about storytelling and how you need to dramatize, also the difficult points, how you, in order to make it interesting. You know, nothing is more boring than, here comes the hero and he succeeded and here you have like the best product ever. That's not a story. You know, you need to really think of it as if you're writing a novel or if you're making a Hollywood movie.
Right. Well, two aspects I'd remark, because they often come as a surprise to people, is that, again, good stories work just as much in a business-to-business context. We even have a great case study on GE succeeding to sell locomotives better with storytelling, with collaboration with the Discovery Channel. And the other one is that if you tell the story right, people start to engage with you. They're enrolled in the story, as Wolfgang said, and they want you to win. So what was surprising, for example, at P&G, we had a competitor. They had a leaking bottle. It was method. There's no secret around that. They had a leaking bottle, and we were almost like, haha, see this recycled plastic, you know, it's not reliable. That's why we don't have it on our production lines. And it was shocking to see that consumers actually rooted for them. They cheered them on. They said, my bottle is leaking, but I think if you do this and that in the design, maybe it's going to heal. And so once they enroll, they cheer and they're for you versus, you know, jump off the boat as the first opportunity, because they continue to be very skeptical and rationally and focused.
Yeah, because stories actually make you, a story well told make you part of it. It breaks down that barrier wall that we know from a theater. You become involved and you insert yourself into the story, versus a confrontational kind of sales pitch where someone tries to persuade you, you know?
Right, and you have skin in the game. You can see that in things like these crowdfunding brands, for example. It's not only to raise the money, it's to have people that are shareholders who have skin in the game and who will become ardent kind of ambassadors for your brand.
So, but what's the difference between a story and a myth? Is there even a difference? Or is a myth just a story that's not true? Which is what a popular definition is. A lot of people use myth in just that way. Oh, it's mythical. It's not true, or not entirely true anyway. And there's some truth to that, to that definition. Yes, myths are often exaggerated, or they're not entirely fact-based. They're hearsay, or they're aggrandized, or they've inserted kind of magical elements. But myths, for the most parts, are what Joseph Campbell called collective dreams. They really talk to our collective conscious. If you just think of the mythical, all the fairy tales that we all grew up with, the stories that you heard, they kind of ingrain themselves in your brain, in your thinking, in your worldview. Everybody knows the story of Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella, and everybody wants, or any other story that Greek mythical stories, whatever it was, the stories that you grew up with, they always refer to certain patterns, and those patterns shape our way of thinking, that there's a hero, that there's a princess that needs to be rescued, there's a dragon that needs to be slaughtered, and in the end, they're going to live happily ever after. Those patterns, those those plots where there's supposedly only 7 in the world, if you write them well, they really help us connect with each other, because that's what we share, that's what we have culturally in common. But they also help us to understand the world and take on the world. And as today's gods have disappeared from our world largely, brands have taken on that which gods used to be, or the heroes in folklore or in former times. There's 4 functions that generally are being prescribed to myth. There's a metaphysical function where it talks about giving sense to senseless happenings, like when there's a flood coming or something. It tries to kind of explain, the gods had a fight or whatever. There's a cosmological, which is a more kind of like a bigger view on how the world and what role we play within the world, what role the world plays within the universe and so forth. Then there's a sociological role and a pedagogical role, which is like, there's an example for each. But to simplify that a bit, and when we looked at brands and how brands used myth, and honestly, I think when we dug up this idea, and when we did our analysis for the first book in 2006, so it was like 2004, 2005 when we did that, most brands weren't using myth in a very intentional manner. They actually some stumbled upon something, but they weren't necessarily always aware of it. Now I think it's much more aware, because also the awareness of the importance of storytelling has grown, together with the talk about purpose and mission, by the way. But it wasn't then so much yet. But still, you would find basically 2 ways how brands employed mythical storytelling. Number 1 is myth to reach beyond. What does that mean? Well, it talks to the top 2 functions of myth, the cosmological and the metaphysical, by kind of connecting your brand by the story that you tell, or in the way you tell your story, to a power that's much bigger than what we can factually kind of see and measure and objectively quantify in the world. Here's an example, one good example that probably a lot of you may know, at least of the women among you, is Crème de la Mer, and how one of the most expensive skincare brands in the world, and for the longest time, very successful, talks about sea kelp and how it's been made of sea kelp. And there's the story of Dr. Huber and how he had skin burns and he couldn't find anything helping him. And the only thing he finally found was when he concocted the magical broth with sea kelp. And that connects, and there's not really much quantification, much substance given to why this product would actually be better and worth the $400 that you pay for for a jar of moisturizer. But people still, this idea of it connects you with the ocean, which is where we're all coming from. There is a kitchen sink logic into the idea of like the ocean being rejuvenating to your skin and kind of healing, because it is where your skin was born. Same thing. This is basically, if you wish, the male version of Crème de la Mer. This is Cool Water from Davidoff, a brand, a fragrance that's been in the top 10 for 30 years now, and which is hardly ever happens. It's a classic. And it's telling the same story over and over again. The story
hit the water
of the ocean.
I can feel it. This incredible rush of power running right through me. Makes the ocean. Makes the man. Davidoff Cool Water.
When this here is, by the way, the commercial, the original one, which is very similar. Just look at it real quick, and then I'll
Muggy and heavy, so heavy with the heat, and the people all sizzled, sizzle like frying meat. Cool time, what a boy! How does the sunshine make you feel? Cool, what a time, what a boy! Cool water for your wheels. Davidoff, cool water.
Well, see, this was done like 30 years ago. The quality can tell. But you see, it's the same big mythical story. The guy, and everybody knows the feeling, you know, you jump into the ocean, it's the salt water that kind of re-energizes you and gives you this kind of feeling of being up there again. And it's the same story that has been just modernized through time. But it is in essence always the same, which is part of what makes myth so interesting and so intriguing. They are eternal and they are transcultural. They work everywhere. They work whenever. They're not bound to time. Yet, in order for them to work, you have to kind of like execute them in different ways again and again, you know? So the storyline, the mythical core is really working across cultures and times and ages. But of course, executions age, as you can see in this spots.
Yeah, just 2 points here. Well, one, exactly like you say, execution aged. So you need to evolve it. And if you were showing that old Davidoff commercial today, people will turn off the brand, right? So people also learn about how to interpret or detect, if you like, the messages, the commercial messaging. The other thing is a technical one. Maybe some of these films you can't see clearly, so know that I'll post links and you'll be able to click on those videos and take a good look at that guy if you didn't get a sharp picture on the presentation.
Well, actually, they're just in the process of remaking the old story, but again, in a modern way, and you'll see a bit more nudity then. Myth to guide us, the second way. So whereas the first one connects you with the bigger powers that are shaping our world and thus imbuing or elevating your product literally by imbuing it with powers beyond belief, the second direction is a much more earthly one. It's one that really helps us to deal with the trials and tribulations of everyday life. It's like the sociological or the pedagogical function, which directs you or which sets examples of value-driven behavior or kind of like ideals that are currently in our culture. And thus you find followers that identify with that ideal or with the idea that you give it. So it's very timely. This one you'll see a lot, especially in today's purpose-driven world, where you see brands taking on a certain spirit or standing for a certain attitude to life and exemplifying that. It seems much easier, like these examples, for instance, show like Johnny Walker, keep on walking. So have the explorer spirit, or just do it. You know, everybody knows it. Tesla, the Elon Musk, basically the embodiment of the visionary and the future fighter, or always taking on a stance for empowering femininity, and with the campaign, what does it feel like, or what does it mean to do things like a girl? It seems almost inflationary in a way, and sometimes it is. So you have to be very careful that it makes a very sensible connection to the brand and to the product that you're talking about. And don't like latch onto something without any background. The other thing, it's also very, very tricky to live up to it. When you go into the first direction of the myth beyond, you talk about something that nobody can criticize or discuss because it's all make-believe anyway. It's in a world way beyond our world. Here you're talking about values and very specific that usually are connected to very specific behavior that you want to further. And if you don't live up to that, you quickly run into trouble. So if you're, for instance, as a Nike, you do something that is not in the spirit of an athlete in fair playing, you run into trouble. Or if Always, for instance, is being discovered of not being an equal pair for women, then the whole idea falls flat and you actually fall mightily. Here is just a quick example because it's quite funny. It's from a smallish, but actually the largest, fastest growing brand in the UK, Brewdog Beer. It's a beer company, craft beer. Nothing really revolutionarily new, but they did it in a way combined with crowdfunding and so forth. And it's actually it's quite funny. I'm not going to show you the whole thing. You can check it out online, but it's it really is the typical idea of a hero in this case going out to fight against bland tasting beer.
Travel to Scandinavia, find the holy moose and save him from bland industrial beer. Only then will you succeed with your crowd-funded beer revolution.
That's a moose head, mate.
The holy moose has beckoned us. We've got to go to Scandinavia. And we've got to go now. Look, can't you see it? It's the holy moose.
Oh, no.
It's the holy moose.
Can't see it.
Come on.
Okay, and on it goes and on it goes. And they tell the story. Here is an example, the very late example of Billie Eilish with Telecom, with T-Mobile. I'll just watch it.
Look at us. Just a bunch of kids that are screen obsessed. Not in the moment, right? Because, like, how can a generation that lives online know anything about the real world? We're just clicking and swiping our way through life. Phones in our hands, and our heads in the cloud.
More than half of the world population is under the age of 30.
No, bro, figured.
So I believe it to be a moral obligation to involve youth in decision-making processes.
So maybe next time they see us staring at a screen and they ask us what we're doing on it, why don't we show them what we're doing with it?
So obviously here,
look at us.
Why does it always play?
Look at us.
Okay. Obviously Billie Eilish and T-Mobile start talking about the idea of the empowered youth, or Fridays for Future, whatever we want, but the next generation taking on the fight for a better society, for a better tomorrow. Before Holy Moose did it in a more fun way. But no matter which way you do it, normally, so you can do it in whichever way. You can do it in an ironic, self-ironic way, like Brewdog did. You must be aware, though, that usually in this, if you follow a mythical approach, myths are serious because the topics that you try to evoke are serious. The values usually are held serious by people, and the metaphysics are held serious by people. And so if you're being too funny or funny in the wrong way, it can backfire easily because you're undermining yourself. So be careful with humor when you do mythical storytelling. Generally, we say the best way up is to go deep. Yes, JP?
Yeah, it seems to me also that it's very important that you as a brand are committed to this,
yes.
That you consistently do this, which doesn't mean you need to repeat yourself all the time or you need to do it in the same way, but I guess it's brands, let's say T-Mobile starting a new campaign next month, and so on, that destroy the myth, that literally burst the bubble, don't they?
That's exactly what I meant before, Leo. If you take on a certain value or a certain position, i.e., for instance, you're trying to support young people and their fight for a better world, then you better make sure that that is reflected in everything that you do. Then you can't run away and kind of like price yourself so far out of the game that young people can't afford you. Or you can like make a freeze for all internships or whatever, any way that you connect with young, then you make better sure that you also empower young people and don't just hold up the flag of empowering the youth, and don't do it yourself.
Right.
Making myth, we're not going to get much into it because that in and of itself would be a seminar, a whole seminar, not just like an hour, never mind. A quick talk, just to spike your interest, perhaps. There is a lot of books on storytelling, story writing, and particularly when it comes to mythical storytelling, because there's supposedly even 7 plots that rule everything in the world, just like there are supposedly only a number of patterns that you find in everything. But this is a condensation of the approach that Joseph Campbell follows. And you'll see already, if you look at it closely, it's very familiar to you. You know, there's always, every Disney movie follows this path. Every kind of Hunger Games or whatever it is, you know, they all follow the same path. There is the idea of a calling, there's a problem, there's something that's wrong. Then there's the hero that steps up and has an idea or has a way that he wants to fight it. He goes out, he meets challenges, fights that he has to fight. He comes to some kind of like that reinforces his belief. Then comes the idea where he kind of succeeds, almost, but not quite. It's very fragile still, you know. But then eventually it becomes confirmed, and he kind of establishes principles that are solving the problem that he set out to solve. And then ultimately you're living in the future that is supposedly better and brighter until the next calling, the next challenge comes up. But that really, just to give you an idea of, it is doable. You can write stories and you can write myths. You need to kind of like put your head around it and kind of read a little bit about it and perhaps take a class or two. But otherwise, you just hire a good agency and they do it for you. Or even better yet, a good storyteller, because often agencies aren't the best storytellers necessarily. And I know what I'm talking about. There is this great quote from T.S. Eliot, a little bit older already. He had known that I would be abusing it for something as mundane as marketing. He probably would rotate in his grave, but it fits so perfectly here. In the age of experiential marketing, you want to make sure that people don't just have them experience, but never know what they had it for. They shouldn't miss the meaning that every experience, everything that you do, every time you engage people, it should all pay into the bigger story, into the bigger myth that you want them to understand and connect with. That's why this meta story, and we'll, as JP already said, at the very end, we'll show you an example where it all comes together. Once you have that big mythical story that you want to be about, it gives you guidance for what you do and what you shouldn't do. But at the same time, it helps people out there each time they connect with you or they engage with you to kind of build like a puzzle. The picture becomes clearer and clearer, and it all pays into your brand and into your equity and into the bias that they build up. So key points. Myths are, yes, they're half true, but they're collective dreams. That's much more important. They are what connects us, what builds our culture, what drives us, what helps us look at the world, judge it, and understand it. They can elevate brands through 4 functions, as we talked about, but really 2 are the most important ones. One is where you connect with a bigger divine, the powers that are beyond our reach, or you do the guiding function, which helps us find values or how to behave in the here and now. Executionally, you can really play it in whichever way. You can do like a Billie Eilish kind of like music video kind of thingy. You can do like a self-ironic moose hunt. You can do a very kind of a movie with a lot of pathos and a lot of like, so it doesn't matter which way you do it, but you have to be careful with humor, because humor does usually undermine the power. And then there's 7 phases, as we said, but again, don't take that with a grain of salt, because it's the basic direction that's important, but everybody can do it in his or her own way. We're not going to get too much further into how you develop your myth. It's just important for you to understand how important it is. But here's one thing that comes up again and again, and that you'll probably stumble across whenever you work with a client or when you are at the client. People have heard about archetypes, and it's been very fashionable in the last 10, 15 years to do something with archetypes. There's been lots of books and marketing books that have been written about it. And yes, when it comes to myth, it can be helpful, but you also have to be careful. What are archetypes first, perhaps, to explain? Archetypes have been around forever. Even Socrates talked already about archetypes, but C.G. Jung was the one, Carl Gustav Jung, contemporary of Freud and founder of today's psychoanalytic thinking, was the one who brought it into our today's socio-psychological vernacular. Archetypes are pre-existing forms or patterns or themes within the collective subconscious, which we use for guidance in living our lives and to shape our identities or look at others. And you see already in that definition how much overlay. You could also put myth here instead of archetypes, and you'd come to the same thing. The difference of archetypes versus myth, it's same thing, just myths are like bigger stories, whereas archetypes usually are snippets of a story or are the character, the main character within a given myth or story. But archetypes can also be patterns. So it's behavioral patterns also. It's not just necessarily a person. It can also be ways of acting. There's often you'll find 12 iconic archetypes. I don't have to go into them in detail. There's usually something like a hero, there's a sage, there's a caretaker, there's a rebel, there's an explorer or the adventurer. The problem that we often have in reality is that these archetypes, if you just look at 12 or the 12 iconic ones that you find a lot of books, they don't get you very far. Because today's world is a bit more complex and also a bit more fragmented. So if you look at any given category and a brand within a given category, usually there's more than 1, 2, or 3 players in that category. So you would be coming to an end very quickly when you think about which archetype am I, because everybody's going to be the same archetype in a given category. I mean, there's like half of those category archetypes or more you can forget already in certain categories. Yeah, whatever. If you're doing like something about food, you're probably never going to be a spiritual, intellectual advocate or a rebel. So those probably will fall by the wayside. It only leaves a certain number. But what's much more interesting, therefore, is this is, by the way, a classical archetype story, and you see already there's only so many heroes that you can have within a given category. But what's much more interesting is actually the concept of kenotypes. What are kenotypes? Kenotypes, as this thingy shows, they are somewhere between an archetype and a stereotype. Kenotypes are basically amalgamations of archetypes that are prevalent in today's culture. So they take the timeless concept of archetypes, but connect it with our world, the world that we live in. So to just give you an example, so this was like something that we once did for women. We called it Dream Girls, and it's already a while ago, but it was trying to assess the different kind of female idols that are in the world, role models, and that you could play. And you see here already, you have like something like, yes, you have the mother from the caretaker or caregiver that comes to mother, but there's also something like the girl next door, or there's something like the soulmate, all very much driven by the heart. But then you have something like the princess that connects like the virgin and the caregiver and the nymph. So you have, I don't know why it jumps sometimes. So what I want to say is there is a way to play with archetypes that gets you much further, that take the idea of archetypes as a basic direction, as an inspiration for understanding the abstracted kind of role models that a brand can take on, or that certain people do. And but don't be bound by the 12 that are usually found in literature. Connect those and mix those and see how you can build something that is much more real in today's culture, because nobody is so one-dimensionally just one thing all the time. Here's an example of how we did that. It's actually for Acqua di Parma. It's a fragrance, or it's more than a fragrance, but originally it was a fragrance, like one of the classic Italian, one of the first colonias, the Colonia, by the way. And in the meantime, it's become kind of like a style brand, an Italian style brand that has also lots of other products, but still at the core, it's still a Colonia. And we were charged with revitalizing the brand. And one of the challenges, of course, was to develop a brand character or an identity for the brand. Like who does the brand want to connect with, and who does the brand want to project for that matter, because if you want to connect with a certain Uber target, you need to kind of have that aspiration within yourself. You need to stand for that. And so we combined like different kind of archetypal ideas, like that of the tastemaker and that of the caregiver and that of the hero, and combine them and roll them into something which we ultimately call the new nobility, the man that we describe that is aristocratic, but not by birth, but aristocratic in his approach to the world, where he's empathetic, where he's taking responsibility for his actions, taking care of the people around him, and doing everything with passion. And this is just a quick view to
whether I'm right, whether I'm wrong, time it goes by, life it goes on, when the light is on my side. Love reveals itself to me, then I can. Yes, I can. I can be set free. Every garden can grow. Every mouth can form a smile. So let yourself go.
So again, we don't need to watch the whole thing. But the point that I want to make is it helps you, instead of connecting to just one of the 12 archetypes, you'll have ways of modulating them, combining them. And for instance, in this case, develop an idea about masculinity that is modern, that's not toxic, that still is masculine. He's still proudly male and doesn't turn himself into some like where he's issues with his masculinity, but he's masculine in a positive sense, where he uses his power in order to take care of people, or where he uses his strength to defend certain values that he has, or his family, and so forth. So there's warmth in everything, and it's not a toxic masculinity that just abuses his power. Key points. Archetypes are forms, themes of our collective subconscious, and they thus can help us really develop a myth. Or, for instance, when you have a person at the helm, like Elon Musk, he naturally kind of takes on a certain archetype and thus becomes the hero of your story, of your myth. And so it's important to think about them. But the iconic 12 often aren't getting you very far. So really you need to, in today's culture, which is much more fragmented, much more broken and eclectic, you need to kind of like work them a bit more to not become too blatant and too boring and crude. And chronotypes are thus a much better way to go with. This is the end of our part 1. 45 minutes, as any good school hour should have. We're going to take a quick break. Mr. Professor?
Yeah, I think the story here shows how powerful stories are, no pun intended. I think definitely a lot of brands, as you alluded yourself, have discovered that, and we see storytelling all over the place. You can definitely make a quick buck with it, as we've seen also in the experiment by Josh and Rob, etc. But it seems to me that this power of brand elevation through myth and building it carefully, not only by reading a book like this one here that has popularized this in marketing, but actually constructing beyond these stereotypical archetypes to mix it all up and create things like kenotypes that you were talking about. It's only that really allows you to elevate the brand. And I guess most importantly, if I got it right, that you actually live it. It's almost like the difference between saying you're luxury and being luxury. So the manifestations of your brand need to be in the mythical realm, need to be consistent in that way to actually achieve that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it needs to be built in. You need, whatever you do needs to be built inside out. So the story that you develop here, the myth that you develop for your brand, should be as much, or first and foremost, actually, a guidance for yourself, for your employees, for your organization, for the brand culture that you develop inside, and then you project it outside, and it's going to be something for people to sign up for, support and follow. But
well,
yes,
excellent.
should guide
which is
yourself.
also an excellent segue then for the part 2, which is going to come up. So click on that video when you have digested this first part, which is heavy enough. Look maybe at some of the videos we've seen. When we're going to talk about more of the execution. How do you actually talk the tonality, the media, and then myth as kind of a guide for the execution. That will be video 2. So we'll see you soon. Thanks, Wolfgang. Let's grab a drink.
See you at video 2
and get ready for this part. See you there.
See you.